Gentlemen, in the last video, we discussed our current political climate and how we can respond to that climate by Plan A, amassing local power, and Plan B, having a contingency-based preparedness plan. But in this video, we want to get into the diagnostics. We want to talk about why we got to this political climate, and particularly, we're going to focus on why our liberties have dissolved over time. And a lot of why can be traced back to one particular fact, which is that the Constitution failed. And what's more, that we knew it would fail 250 years ago. In the past 100 years, most criticism of the Constitution has said that it does not give the federal government enough power. But my position is the exact opposite of that. The main failure of the Constitution was that it failed to limit the federal government enough, and that's why we see the dissolution of our rights today. Now, this is really important to understand. In our day, we debate stuff like restrict the right to bear arms or not in the political world. The Founding Fathers did not do that. The Founding Fathers all agreed that you ought not restrict the right to bear arms, obviously, or else you get tyranny. And so their goal was not to determine what's the best things to protect, but rather to figure out how to protect those rights and make sure that the federal government over time does not take them away. That's why the Constitution failed ultimately. They knew their goal, but they failed to achieve it. Now, there was one person who saw this coming, and his name was Patrick Henry. We know him for his speech, "Give me liberty or give me death," which motivated the colonists to go and fight against the British Empire for the sake of their rights. But more important than that speech was the work that he did so as to try and preserve our rights as best he could, fighting against a constitution that he knew would ultimately dissolve them. Before the ratification of the Constitution, the United States were united under the Articles of Confederation, which had a federal government, but it was much smaller and weaker. Now, it was under this system of unification that they won the War for Independence under the Continental Congress's direction. And so it had been successful up to that point. But at the same time, certain people, known as the Federalists, had complaints, particularly with regards to the economy and the trade system and other issues. Thus, they drafted the Constitution as an alternative that made the federal government stronger. Now, there were people who opposed this, the Anti-Federalists. Patrick Henry was one of the main Anti-Federalists, and he, in fact, didn't even attend the original discussion for the Constitution's ratification in Virginia. He is famously quoted to have said, "I smelt a rat." And what he meant by that was that he was suspicious of what the Constitution would bring about. In time, we saw that although James Madison, one of the main Federalists, actually did seem to believe in liberties and was trying to protect them with the Constitution, his friend Alexander Hamilton actually did not appear to believe in small government, and he proposed the Constitution particularly because he wanted it to become more expansive. Patrick Henry is quoted to have said, "You are not to inquire how your trade may be increased, nor how you are to become a great and powerful people, but how your liberties can be secured, for liberty ought to be the direct end of your government." Now, Patrick Henry was making an important point here, which is that the greatest evils come not from being weaker than the countries around you, but from your own government oppressing you. And thus, liberty has to be the priority at all times, because a free people will generally prosper if the government does not get in their way and they have the protection of God-given rights. But you get in the way of that, and suddenly everything begins to fall apart. So liberty must always come first. Now let's talk about some of the particular complaints he had for different ways in which the Constitution made the federal government more powerful so as to dissolve the rights that we had over time. The first failure of the new Constitution is that it allowed the federal government to oppress the people via taxation, which is something completely foreign to the Articles of Confederation, which had the requisition system. The requisition system basically said if the federal government or the Continental Congress wanted some federal funds, they had to ask the states to provide it. And then the states could essentially decide how much they wanted to give, which meant that the federal government was completely reliant on the consent of the states in order to get things through to completion. Now, this is an amazing way to limit the power of the federal government, because now the states have to consent on an individual basis in order for the federal government to do anything which allows for the primacy to remain with the states. Now, obviously, if you like the federal government and you think the federal government needs to do this or that, then you might say that this is going to be a really big hindrance to progress, but that's the exact point. The federal government isn't supposed to make a lot of progress. The federal government was supposed to be an incredibly small part of the American life. This is why early on, even after the Constitution was ratified, there were certain presidential elections where it wasn't even contested. People didn't even care about the position nearly as much as state legislatures, state governorships, etc. Patrick Henry understood this, which is why he said, "An English army was sent to compel us to pay money contrary to our consent, to force us by arbitrary and tyrannical coercion to satisfy their unbounded demands. We wished to pay with our own consent. Rather than pay against our consent, we engaged in that bloody contest, which terminated so gloriously. By requisitions we pay with our own consent. By their means we have triumphed in the most arduous struggle that ever tried the virtue of man." In defense of the effectiveness of this system, even with the limited federal government funds, Patrick Henry also had this to say about the War for Independence. "Requisitions are attended with one singular advantage. They are attended by deliberation. They secure to the states the benefit of correcting oppressive errors. If our assembly thought requisitions erroneous, if they thought the demand was too great, they might at least supplicate Congress to reconsider, but it was a little too much." The second failure of the Constitution was its failure to protect enumerated rights. Now, initially, the Constitution didn't even have a Bill of Rights, which is something that Patrick Henry said must be there because we cannot expect politicians to protect those rights and assume they're protected without it being particularly enumerated. Basically, his idea was, if you're gonna make the federal government so powerful, you need to make sure that particular infringements are banned. That's why the Bill of Rights needed to exist. And it took years for that to occur. And once it did occur, Patrick Henry was still disappointed because it didn't go far enough. People did not protect rights over time like the original founders and the original Federalists thought that they would. So Patrick Henry accurately predicted that. In our day, we see the Bill of Rights as the great document that only we could get back to that, then we would be in such a good spot. But Patrick Henry knew that the Bill of Rights would not be respected like they hoped. And as time went on, like it has, it would be ignored. As to my opinion of the amendments, I think they will tend to injure rather than to serve the cause of liberty. Additionally, there's this issue with the Bill of Rights, which is that people who care about liberty get fixated on them, and they think, I would have liberty if only the Supreme Court ruled against this law or that law to protect my Second Amendment rights or my First Amendment rights, etc. Whereas if we just understood that the document was broken in the first place, then we might go about reprioritizing the local, amassing power there, and starting anew. The third chief failure of the Constitution was its way of minimizing the militia as organized by the people in the states by giving the federal Congress the power to arm and commission them. Now, it's important to note the militia was a much bigger deal as well in the time of Patrick Henry. He had said that the militia was their chief security and that there can be no safety without militias. In our day, we see militias as essentially a side thing, practically non-existent because we have a standing army. In the time of the Founding Fathers, they hated the idea of a standing army and they understood that as very perilous to liberty. But then going back to the militia issue, militias are supposed to be organic and they're supposed to be consensual and they're supposed to be derived from the ground up. People come together and they say, it's time to address this emergency. But when you make it so that the federal Congress has the power to commission and arm them, then it centralizes that power of the sword to the federal government in a way that is very, very bad for liberty, because the militia is not just there to protect against foreign threats, but against that very centralized government. So to give that power to the Congress and emphasize that would ultimately lead to exactly what we see today, which is that militias are oppressed, discouraged, and not effective for protecting rights. When this power is given up to Congress without limitations or bounds, how will your militia be armed? You trust to chance. For sure I am that that nation which shall trust its liberties in other hands cannot long exist. The fourth chief failure of the Constitution was how it tended towards the consolidation of federal power. And this is ultimately something that is caused by all of the other factors we just listed. When the federal government is left to decide its own powers in certain degrees because of the fact that only certain rights are protected within the Constitution, and then additionally, When you amass its militaristic power and its power to tax all together, that leads to the federal government's becoming the center of gravity in a way that violates people's rights and restricts the power of the states, which is exactly what Patrick Henry predicted and was trying to avoid. That is what we can see in society today. The federal government has become such a big deal to us that the national news cycle has completely overshadowed local politics, even though ultimately the federal government still will never be able to influence our lives the way local changes will. If consolidation proves to be as mischievous to this country as it has been to other countries, what will the poor inhabitants of this country do? This government will operate like an ambuscade. It will destroy the state governments and swallow the liberties of the people without giving them previous notice. So now we've talked about some of the faults of the Constitution and how it allowed the federal government to expand in power. But now let's talk about how that causes political violence. We're going to give 3 specific reasons. The first one of which is that the federal government itself has engaged in political violence against its citizens as it expands. Now, we think of political violence as this guy kills this guy, 2 individuals, but most political violence that occurs is from the federal government on its own people, and we can see instances of this in Ruby Ridge, in Waco, and similar circumstances where the ATF or some kind of agency with no accountability to the people says, this guy has a shotgun barrel that's too short, now we're going to go after him. That's political violence, and that occurs from the federal government to its people because it has gotten way too powerful with no accountability. The second reason the expansion of the federal government has led to political violence is an elimination of discourse. Now, the reason why discourse has gotten so terrible on the federal level is because it's impossible to discuss such big issues when you've got 330 million people's lives at stake. You're not going to get anywhere. And in the last video, we discussed exactly why that is. So the expansion of the federal government diverts focus to the federal level discourse. And then the federal level discourse gets more and more divided as the states drift apart, which means that at the end of the day, all you have is political violence in order to make a point. Words have no sway. Words mean nothing when you have so many different voices and so many different factors influencing what happens on a national scale with so many people sticking their hands in the process. With that said, political violence is a natural result of diverting energy towards one huge source of power that no one can control. Third reason the expansion of the federal government has led to political violence is the creation of death ground. Now, death ground refers to when someone is in a position where they believe it's kill or be killed. Either they will kill their enemy or they will be destroyed. And that motivates people, obviously, to be more violent. Now, why does the federal government create death ground? Well, what it does is it expands on so much power that people who believe that they are the enemy of the federal government suddenly think, okay, well, something's got to change. I got to fight back. I got to do something to prevent myself from being genocided. Now, we can discuss whether or not that is accurate. For example, I know transgenders obviously talk about that there's a genocide against them all the time, and you can discuss whether or not that's actually occurring or whether transgenders are actually more accepted and free than at any point in human history. But that's not relevant here. What's relevant is that the federal government is so powerful that if it decided to commit a genocide against some particular group of people, it would have that power. It would have the logistics and the intelligence in order to administrate that either overtly or covertly. The creation of death ground is what leads people into political violence, and it's what's going to lead to more political violence as time goes on. With the assassination of Charlie Kirk, which obviously was a tragedy, that was acclaimed because of claimed death ground from the left, but then additionally has created death ground on the right, or a perception of it. People say, there's no turning back here, we have to fight. That is the kind of discourse that leads to people engaging in political violence. It's happening on both sides because the federal government is such a heavy source of power that they want to vie for that source. So gentlemen, that's a quick summary of the failures of the Constitution and why that leads to political violence. And a quick note on that, we didn't even address violence as a whole, which also has proliferated because of the failures of the Constitution. We've been focusing on political violence in particular, and we may address violence as a whole in a future video. So when we look at the whole of it, the Constitution clearly had some flaws from the very beginning, and in the next video, we want to talk about progress to be made from the lessons we learned from the Constitution, from the things that Patrick Henry said in the first place, and from some things that even Patrick Henry missed when it comes to formulating a group of people who are going to protect each other's rights. In the next video, we want to talk about civil covenanting and community and how that can be used to protect God-given rights. This is Armored Republic, and a republic there is no king but Christ.